I want to tell you about the day I sat across from a neurologist I had never met and answered questions I could have answered at 17 years old. What year is it? Who is the current president? Count backward from 100 by sevens. I answered every one of them correctly, without hesitation, without the particular careful pause of a person who is searching for something that used to be there and isn't anymore. I answered them the way I had answered questions for 69 years, directly, precisely, with the specific confidence of a woman who has always known her own mind and has never had reason to doubt it. The neurologist looked at his clipboard. He looked at me. And then he said something that I have thought about every day since. He said, "Mrs. Caldwell, I have to be honest with you. Based on everything I'm seeing today, I am not sure why you were referred to me." I looked at him. I said, "I know exactly why I was referred to you." He waited. I said, "My daughter sent me here, and my daughter has spent the last 18 months telling everyone who will listen that I am losing my mind." The neurologist set down his clipboard, and we had a very different conversation than the one my daughter had intended us to have. My name is Ruth Annette Caldwell, 69 years old, retired principal of Jefferson High School in Birmingham, Alabama, where I spent 35 years managing students and parents and teachers and every variety of human difficulty that passes through the doors of a public high school in a city that has more of everything, more history, more struggle, more stubborn, specific grace than most people give it credit for. I ran that school for 19 of those 35 years. I want you to understand what that means practically, not the title, not the administrative category of it, but the daily reality of being the person responsible for the safety and education and well-being of 1,400 young people in a building where something is always on fire, metaphorically speaking, and where the person at the top of the organizational chart is the person every problem eventually reaches. I spent 19 years being the last stop, the person who had seen everything and could not be rattled and would not be moved and whose assessment of a situation was, in the experience of everyone who worked for her, the most reliable one in the room. I know what manipulation looks like. I have been watching it walk through my office door for 35 years. I missed it with Angela. And I have spent a long time, not blaming myself, I want to be precise about that, because what Angela did was Angela's choice, and I am not in the business of redistributing her responsibility onto my own shoulders. But I have spent a long time understanding how a woman who could read a room the way I could read a room did not see her own daughter working it. The answer, when I arrived at it, was the same answer it always is. I trusted her. She was my daughter. And the specific blind spot that love creates, the structural inability to hold what you see and what you know about a person in the same frame at the same time, that blind spot does not get smaller because you have a graduate degree and 35 years of professional experience reading people. If anything, it gets larger, because the more certain you are of your own judgment, the less likely you are to turn it on the people you love. Angela knew that. Angela had been watching me for 44 years. She knew exactly where to stand. Before we go any further, drop a comment and tell me where you are watching from. City, state, what time it is there. I read every one. I want to know who is in this room with me today. And I have a question for you before we start. Have you ever been so certain of what you knew about a person that you stopped checking whether what you knew was still true? Leave your answer below, because that is the question this story is built on. And if you are not subscribed, do that now, because Ruth has been quiet about Angela for long enough, and she is done being quiet. And let me tell you who I was before Angela decided I wasn't myself anymore, because I think the before matters in this particular story more than it matters in almost any other, and I want to be deliberate about establishing it. When someone steals your money, there is a paper trail. When someone forges your signature, there is a document. When someone strips your house while you are at the cemetery, there are witnesses and inventory lists, and the specific recoverable evidence of physical objects that were present and then were not. When someone steals your reputation, when someone takes the thing you have spent 69 years building, the specific hard-earned authority of a woman who has proven herself in rooms that did not always want her there. The evidence is different. It lives in people's memories. In the way a conversation shifts when you walk in the careful, pitying quality of attention that people give you when they have been told to watch for signs. I want you to understand what was taken before I tell you how it was taken. I grew up in Birmingham. Not the Birmingham of the history books, though that Birmingham was present in my childhood in ways that a child absorbs without fully understanding. In the particular vigilance of my parents, in the conversations that stopped when I entered rooms, in the stories that circulated through our church community about things that had happened and things that might still happen, and the specific, exhausting alertness of people who know that the world requires more of them than it should. I understood what that alertness cost. I decided early that I was going to make it mean something. My mother was a school teacher. My father worked for the Postal Service for 31 years. They were people who understood that education was not simply a credential, but a form of armor. The specific portable protection of a mind that has been trained to think clearly and cannot be taken from you regardless of what else is. They sent me to school with that understanding baked in, and I arrived at it myself independently by the time I was 12 and have never departed from it since. I went to Tuskegee. 4 years, education degree, graduated 1977 with the specific focused energy of a woman who knows exactly what she is going to do and is ready to start doing it. I went back to Birmingham. I got a job at Jefferson High School as an English teacher at 22 years old, and I walked into my first classroom on a September morning and looked at 31 teenagers who were testing me, the way teenagers always test a new teacher, and I looked back at them with the calm and total confidence of a woman who has been preparing for this room her entire life. They stopped testing me by October. I met Gerald Caldwell in 1979. He was a civil engineer, quiet, methodical, the kind of man who approached every problem with the patient, systematic attention of someone who understands that structures hold because of what is underneath them, and not because of how they look from the outside. He was not flashy. He was not the kind of man who filled a room. He was the kind of man who, when he said something, meant it, and whose meaning and his saying were so consistently aligned that you stopped waiting for the gap between them. I married him in 1981. We had 2 children. Angela first, in 1980. Yes, before the wedding, which was a fact that I am noting because it is relevant to understanding Angela and her relationship to me, and to the particular history between us. I was 23 years old and unmarried and pregnant in Birmingham, Alabama in 1980, and the experience of navigating that, the specific daily negotiation of other people's opinions about my choices, gave me a clarity about what I would and would not apologize for that has stayed with me for 49 years. I did not apologize. I raised my daughter. I married Gerald 2 years later when we were both certain and not because convention required it. Our Angela was the flower girl at our wedding, which she will tell you she does not remember but which I have on a photograph that she cannot dispute. Our son David came in 1984. 4 years between them, which meant they were close enough to be companions and far enough apart to be strangers to each other's specific childhood experiences. David lives in Atlanta now. He is a good man, steady, honest, the kind of person who calls when he says he will and shows up when he is needed. He and Angela have never been close, which I understood for most of their lives as a simple incompatibility of temperament, and which I understand now as something more specific. David could not be managed. Angela managed people. I want to say that carefully because I am trying to be accurate rather than simply damning. And the accurate thing is that Angela's ability to manage people, to read what they needed, to present herself in the way that would be most effective for the situation, to understand the room and position herself within it, was not always and only a negative quality. It made her effective. It made her, for most of her professional life, someone who advanced and succeeded and was trusted with responsibility because she understood how to make the people above her feel that trusting her was the right decision. She learned it watching me. I want to sit with that for a moment because I think it is the most honest and the most uncomfortable thing I have to say in this entire story. Angela learned to read rooms from a woman who read rooms professionally. She learned to manage people from a woman who had managed people for 35 years. She learned the specific practical skills of institutional navigation from the person who had demonstrated them most consistently and most successfully in her immediate environment. She learned from me. And then she turned what she learned on me. Gerald died in 2019. Pancreatic cancer diagnosed in March, gone by August. 5 months from the scan that showed the mass to the morning I sat beside his bed in the specific, suspended silence of a person who has been holding vigil long enough to understand when the vigil is over. 5 months is not enough time. There is no enough time for something like Gerald, but 5 months is particularly insufficient. Too short for acceptance, long enough for anticipatory grief to have worn you down before the actual grief arrives. I want to tell you about Gerald and Angela, because the relationship between them is part of the architecture of what came next, and I would be telling an incomplete story if I left it out. Gerald loved Angela. I do not doubt that. He was a man who loved his children with the specific, uncomplicated warmth of a person who does not require his children to be anything other than what they are, and Angela, whatever else she is his daughter, and carries his eyes and his particular way of tilting her head when she is thinking, and 100 other small physical inheritances that I notice every time I look at her. But Gerald also saw her clearly, more clearly, I think, than I did. He said to me once, I think he said it in 2015, we were in the kitchen, one of those conversations that arrives without announcement and that you remember with perfect specificity for years afterward. He said, Ruth, Angela is the most capable person I know, and I am not always sure that is a good thing. I asked him what he meant. He thought about it. He said, capable people can do more damage than incapable ones, because they can see further ahead, because they can plan. I thought about that conversation for a long time after he said it. I thought about it more after he was gone, and I thought about it most in the months when I began to understand what Angela had been planning. Gerald's death changed Angela, and this is the more accurate version, the one I have arrived at after considerable time and considerable reluctance. Gerald's death removed the thing that had been keeping Angela's particular capabilities oriented in a direction that did not harm me. While Gerald was alive, there was a check, not a formal one, not a conversation they had or an agreement they made, simply the specific gravity of a man whose clarity about his daughter was something she understood and respected and did not wish to be on the wrong side of. Gerald never said anything to Angela that I know of. He did not need to. She knew what he saw when he looked at her. And she knew that as long as he was there, I had someone beside me who was seeing the same thing. And then he was gone. And I was 67 years old. And I was alone in a house in Birmingham that was too large for one person and full of the specific consuming silence of a life that used to have 2 people in it. And Angela called. Of course Angela called. She called every day in the weeks after the funeral. She came to the house on weekends. She sat with me and made tea and sorted through Gerald's things with the gentle, competent efficiency of a daughter who is showing up for her mother in a time of need. She was kind. She was present. She was everything a daughter should be in the immediate aftermath of a loss like that, and I was grateful for every hour of it. I was grateful. I was also, I understand now, beginning to be managed. Not dramatically, not in any way that would have tripped the alarm of a woman with 35 years of reading rooms professionally. In the small ways. The first small ways that I could only see in hindsight, looking back from the neurologist's office on a day 18 months later, identifying the moment the architecture began. She started asking if I was sleeping. Every call. How are you sleeping, Mama? Are you eating? You seemed a little confused when we talked on Tuesday. Do you remember what you said? I remembered what I said. I told her I remembered. She said, "Of course you do. I just want to make sure you're okay." And I heard what any grieving woman hears when her daughter asks if she is okay. I heard love. I did not hear the beginning of a plan. I want to tell you how it worked, not the emotional experience of it. I will get to that. I want to start with the mechanics, with the how described as precisely as I can describe it, because I think the how is the most important part of this story for anyone who might be watching and wondering whether something like this is happening to them. This is how you gaslight someone at scale. You do not start with the person. You start with their world. Angela did not come to me in the first months and tell me I was confused. She did not sit across from me and say, "Mama, I'm worried about your memory. I think something is wrong." That would have been a conversation I could engage with. That would have been a claim I could respond to, evidence I could contest, a direct exchange between two people who know each other and who have the shared history to navigate disagreement. She did not give me the conversation. She gave it to everyone else first. Her first call, as best I have been able to reconstruct, was to my sister Paulette. Paulette is 72. She lives in Huntsville, 3 hours away, and we speak every week and see each other 3 or 4 times a year. Paulette is not a suspicious person. She is warm and generous and inclined to believe the best of the people she loves, which includes Angela, whom she has known since Angela was born, and whom she has always regarded with the particular affection of an aunt who does not have to do the daily work of raising a child and can therefore enjoy her without reservation. Angela called Paulette approximately 6 weeks after Gerald's funeral. I know this because Paulette told me. Later, much later, after everything had come apart and been examined, and the full timeline had been reconstructed with the specific, a painful clarity of people who are trying to understand how they got somewhere they never intended to go. Paulette told me what Angela had said, and she told me with the specific, mortified honesty of a woman who loves her sister and who had been, without knowing it, recruited into something she would never have agreed to had she understood what it was. Angela told Paulette she was worried about me. She said I had been forgetful since Gerald's death, that she understood grief affected cognition. She had read about it, she said, but that what she was seeing in me seemed like more than grief, that there had been moments in conversation where I had repeated myself without realizing it, that I had mentioned an appointment I had no memory of mentioning. Small things, nothing alarming on its own, but accumulating. Paulette listened. Of course Paulette listened. She had just lost her brother-in-law. Her sister was alone and grieving and 67 years old, and her niece was calling with the specific loving concern of a daughter who was paying close attention. There was nothing in that phone call for Paulette to push back against. There was no claim outrageous enough to trigger her skepticism. There was only a worried daughter and a plausible story and the specific vulnerability of a family in the middle of grief that makes everyone more available to fear. Paulette began to watch me differently. Not with suspicion, with concern. The watching of a person who has been told to look for something and who finds, as people always find when they look for something with enough attention, evidence that confirms what they were looking for. A repeated phrase, or a moment of distraction. The ordinary, unremarkable lapses of a 67-year-old woman who had recently lost her husband of 38 years and who was not operating at full capacity. Paulette saw what Angela had told her she would see. Angela moved outward from there. My friend Carolyn, 30 years of friendship, we had taught at Jefferson together. She had been at my wedding and at Gerald's funeral and at every significant moment in between. Angela called Carolyn. Different version of the same conversation, tailored to the specific relationship. Carolyn was a practical woman, skeptical of drama, unlikely to respond to emotional appeals. So Angela did not make an emotional appeal. She made a practical one. She said she was trying to understand what support structures were in place for me. That she wanted to make sure people who knew me well were keeping an eye out, that she was not trying to alarm anyone just to be responsible. Carolyn began to keep an eye out. My church community. I have been a member of 16th Street Baptist for 40 years. I taught Sunday school for 20 of them. I have relationships in that community that are among the oldest and most sustaining of my life. People who have known me through every version of myself, through the young teacher and the new principal and the wife and the mother and the widow, who carry the full picture of who I am across decades of shared worship and shared life. Angela knew all of them. She had grown up in that church. She began attending services again in the months after Gerald's funeral, all which I welcomed. I thought she was finding her way back to something that had sustained our family, that the loss of her father had reminded her of what the community meant. She sat beside me in the pew. She greeted people warmly. She stayed for coffee hour and had conversations that I was not part of and that I did not think to wonder about, because why would I wonder? She was my daughter. She was coming back to church. I did not know she was working the room. I understand now the specific conversations she had. Not verbatim, but in substance, reconstructed from what people told me afterward. The same architecture in each one. Concern without alarm, love without accusation. The framing of a devoted daughter who was simply trying to make sure the people in her mother's life were aware, who was not asking for anything, who just wanted everyone to be informed. She planted the seed in every conversation, and then she waited for the world to water it. The thing about gaslighting at scale, and I want to be precise about this because I think it is the most important thing I can tell you about how this particular variety of manipulation works. The thing about it is that it does not require the manipulator to be present for most of its effects. Once the narrative is planted in enough minds, the environment itself does the work. Angela did not need to be in every room. She needed to be in the right rooms first, and then the people in those rooms carried the narrative into every other room on her behalf. People began treating me differently, subtly, in the ways that are almost impossible to name in the moment, and that you can only identify in retrospect, comparing the before and after with the specific attention of a woman who has had time to examine what changed and when. Conversations got shorter, not obviously shorter, not with the specific insulting quality of a conversation cut off, just concluded more quickly than they used to be, with the gentle, slightly effortful quality of a person who is managing an interaction rather than having one. People began finishing my sentences, not in the easy, intimate way of people who know each other well enough to complete each other's thoughts. In the careful, anticipatory way of people who have been told that the person they are talking to sometimes loses the thread, and who are ready to catch it, if she does. I noticed. I want to be clear about that. I noticed. The woman who had read rooms professionally for 35 years did not stop reading them. I noticed that something had changed in the quality of attention people gave me, and I noticed that the change had a texture that was not grief-related, not the specific tenderness of people responding to my loss, but something more systematic than that. I said something to Angela. I told her I felt like people were watching me. She looked at me with the expression I would come to know very well over the following months, the careful, loving, slightly pained expression of a daughter who is hearing something concerning and is trying to respond to it with gentleness. She said, "Mama, people love you. They're paying attention because they care about you." I said it felt different from that. She reached across and put her hand over mine. She said, "I know grief can make us feel disconnected sometimes. It can make ordinary interactions feel strange. Have you been sleeping?" I looked at her, and in that moment, I want to be absolutely honest about this. In that moment, I did not see the manipulation. I saw my daughter. I heard the concern in her voice, which was real enough in its surface quality to pass for the genuine article, and I felt the specific, exhausted confusion of a woman who has just had her own clear perception of events reflected back to her as a symptom. Maybe I was disconnected. Maybe the grief was doing something to my perception. Maybe I was not reading the room correctly. I had never doubted my ability to read a room. Angela had just made me doubt it. That was the moment. Looking back, and I have looked back at that moment more times than I can count, with the specific, relentless attention of a woman trying to understand exactly when she lost the thread and how to pick it back up. That conversation at the kitchen table was the moment the ground shifted. Not because Angela had said anything I could point to, not because she had made a claim I could contest, because she had taken my own accurate perception of events and reframed it gently and lovingly as evidence of exactly what she had been telling everyone I had. She handed me my own confusion, and I took it. The power of attorney conversation came 4 months later. I want to tell you how she got there because the path matters. Because the power of attorney was not the first move, it was the last move of an opening sequence that had been 18 months in the building. And understanding the sequence is the only way to understand how a retired principal with 35 years of professional experience reading people signed a document she would not have signed at the beginning of those 18 months. She started with the practical. She said, "Mama, I've been thinking about what happens if you have a medical emergency. You're alone in the house. Gerald handled so much of the financial administration. I just want to make sure that if something happened, I would be able to help quickly without having to navigate legal complications while also trying to take care of you." It was reasonable. It was the kind of thing a responsible daughter says to an aging parent who is living alone after the death of a spouse. It was the kind of thing that responsible adults are encouraged to think about and plan for, and that I myself had read about and nodded along with in the abstract. I said, "Let me think about it." She said, "Of course, take all the time you need." She did not bring it up again for 6 weeks, and in those 6 weeks, without a single direct conversation about the power of attorney, the environment she had built did her work for her. Paulette mentioned, in our weekly call, that she had been thinking about what would happen if I had a fall. Carolyn said, over coffee, that her own daughter had set up something similar after Carolyn's husband passed, and that it had given both of them peace of mind. My pastor of 22 years, the man who had married me and buried Gerald and baptized both my children, mentioned in passing, with the gentle, genuine care of a man who is not aware he is being used, that the church had resources for helping seniors think through estate planning. Every conversation, pointing the same direction. And then Angela came back. She had a lawyer's name. The lawyer's name was Preston Holt. He had an office on the 4th floor of a building in downtown Birmingham that had the specific, comfortable authority of a space designed to make people feel that what they were doing there was sensible and normal and entirely routine. Wood paneling, a diploma's wall, a receptionist who offered me water when I arrived, and who smiled with the practiced warmth of a person whose job includes making clients feel at ease before they sign things. Angela had made the appointment, and I want to note that because it matters, not that she had suggested the attorney, which a daughter arranging her mother's estate planning might reasonably do, but that she had made the appointment, had called Preston Holt's office, had spoken to someone there, had arranged the date and time, and presumably had some version of a conversation about what we were coming in to do. I did not know the content of that conversation. I did not think to ask. I should have thought to ask. Preston Holt was 60-something, silver-haired, with the easy professional manner of a man who has explained legal documents to aging clients for many years, and who has developed over those years a specific practiced gentleness for the task. He shook my hand. He shook Angela's hand. He offered us both water, and he sat across from us at a desk that had a document on it already. Already. The document was already on his desk when we sat down. "I want you to hold that detail." He explained it to me. a durable power of attorney. Durable meaning it would remain in effect if I became incapacitated, which distinguished it from a standard power of attorney that would expire in exactly the circumstances under which it was most likely to be needed. Angela would have authority to make financial and legal decisions on my behalf, to manage my accounts, pay my bills, handle any legal matters that arose. Standard, he said. Very common for someone in my situation. My situation. I looked at the document. I want to tell you what I felt in that office, with the honesty I have been trying to maintain throughout this story, which means telling you that what I felt was not alarm. I did not feel the specific physical warning of a woman whose instincts are telling her something is wrong. I felt the particular flattened quality of a person who has been told, by enough people she trusts, that the situation she is in requires this kind of preparation, and who has arrived at a point of resigned, practical acceptance. This was sensible. This was what responsible adults did. Gerald would have wanted me to have a plan. I signed the document. Angela drove me home. She was warm on the drive, easy. The specific, relaxed warmth of a person who has arrived somewhere she has been working toward, and who is not yet showing what the arrival means to her. She talked about dinner. She talked about David's kids. She talked about whether we might plan a visit in the spring. Ordinary. I did not feel in that car that I had made a mistake. The understanding did not come from me. I want to be clear about that because I think it is important. Because the story I am telling you is not the story of a woman who figured it out herself, who noticed the inconsistencies and followed the thread and arrived at the truth through the application of her own professional skills. That would be a more satisfying story. It would also be a less honest one. The understanding came from Diane Okafor, my former vice principal, 22 years beside me at Jefferson High School. The woman who had been present for more of my professional life than anyone other than Gerald, who had watched me manage every variety of difficult situation that passed through the doors of a public high school. Though who knew the specific texture of my competence in the way that only someone who has worked closely beside a person for 22 years can know it. Diane had retired the year before Gerald died. She lived 20 minutes from me. We had lunch every few weeks, the easy, regular rhythm of two women who had spent decades in professional proximity and who had discovered in retirement that the friendship they had built around the work was sustaining enough to exist without it. I had lunch with Diane in November, 2 months after I signed the power of attorney. I did not tell her about it, not because I was hiding it, because it had not occurred to me as something to report. It was done. It was administrative. It was the kind of practical matter that does not make it into lunch conversation with a friend because it carries no more narrative weight than updating your insurance or renewing your car registration. Diane brought up Angela. She said, I ran into her at the Publix on Claremont last week. I said, oh? She said, she was with a man I didn't recognize. I said, probably a colleague. She works with a lot of people. Diane was quiet for a moment. She had a quality. I had noticed it across 22 years of working beside her, of going quiet when she was deciding whether to say something. Not hesitation exactly, more like the careful, deliberate pause of a woman who has learned to distinguish between the things she should say and the things she should hold, and who takes the distinctions seriously. She said, Ruth, can I ask you something? I said, of course. She said, how have you been feeling lately? Not grief. I mean, how are you feeling in yourself, your mind, your clarity? I looked at her. Something moved in me. Not alarm. Not yet. Something earlier than alarm. The specific, almost physical sensation of a question landing in exactly the place it was always going to land, finding the thing that had been sitting there unexamined and bringing it into the light. I said, why are you asking me that? She set down her fork. She said, because Angela asked me the same question about you 3 months ago. She called me out of the blue and she asked me if I had noticed any changes in you. Any confusion, any memory issues, Any moments where you seemed not quite yourself? I was very still. Diane said, and I told her no, that you seemed exactly like yourself to me, that I had not noticed anything concerning, and she said, Diane, sometimes it's hardest to see in the people closest to us, that maybe I should pay closer attention. Diane looked at me across the table. She said, Ruth, I have worked beside you for 22 years. I know what you look like when you are not quite yourself. I have seen it twice in 2 decades, once when your mother died, and once when David had that accident in 2011, and you were frightened and not sleeping. Both times it lasted about 3 weeks and then you came back. She said, You are not quite yourself. You are exactly yourself. And Angela calling me to suggest otherwise is something I have been thinking about for 3 months and not knowing whether to tell you. I sat with that. The specific had suspended quality of a moment in which the thing you have been dimly aware of and have not allowed yourself to examine is suddenly in full light, and you cannot look away from it, and you cannot go back to not seeing it. She had called Diane. Angela had called Diane. And Diane, who knew me in the specific granular way of 22 years of professional proximity, who could not be managed by a concerned daughter's phone call the way that a grieving aunt or a longtime friend or a beloved pastor could be managed. Diane had pushed back. Diane had said no, and Angela had tried to override the no. I asked Diane what else she knew. She told me. She had not been passive in the 3 months since Angela's call. Diane was not a passive woman. She had been a vice principal, which is a job that requires the specific, active management of situations that other people would prefer to leave alone. And she had brought that instinct to the question of what Angela was doing. She had made some calls of her own. To Carolyn, who confirmed that Angela had reached out. To a woman named Barbara from our church community, who confirmed the same. She had assembled quietly and without telling me a partial picture of how widely Angela had worked. It was wider than I had understood. I drove home from that lunch and I sat in my kitchen, the same kitchen table, always the kitchen table, and I thought about the power of attorney sitting in Preston Holt's filing cabinet with my signature on it. I thought about what it meant, what it actually meant, not the practical meaning Preston Holt had explained, the other meaning. The meaning that lived in the context of an 18-month campaign to convince everyone in my life that I was losing my mind. The meaning that lived beside Angela's calls to Paulette and Carolyn and Barbara and Diane. The meaning that lived in the specific, careful sequence of a person who had constructed a reputation for her mother's incompetence and then arranged for her mother to sign a document that codified it, legally. If I was incompetent, if the narrative Angela had been building was the narrative that held, then the woman who had signed that document had signed it in a diminished state. And the document that a diminished woman signed under the guidance of an attorney her daughter had selected and made the appointment with, are in the presence of a daughter who had spent 18 months preparing the ground. I am a retired principal. I am not a lawyer. But I had spent 35 years in an institution governed by rules and documentation and the specific serious business of what happens when adults with authority over vulnerable people abuse that authority. I understood what I was looking at. I picked up the phone. I did not call Angela. I called Diane. I said, I need an attorney. Not the one Angela found. My own. Diane said, I know someone. Of course she did. Diane's attorney was a woman named Cecilia Marsh, estate litigation and elder law, Birmingham, 32 years of practice. Diane had used her 4 years earlier when Diane's own mother's estate had become complicated in the specific, painful way that estates become complicated when there are multiple children and one of them has been managing the finances and the others have questions about the management. Diane described her with the specific, unambiguous recommendation of a person who has been through something difficult with an attorney and emerged from it with their trust intact. She said, Cecilia does not get rattled, and she does not get outmaneuvered. I called her office the morning after my lunch with Diane. She had a cancellation that Thursday. I want to tell you about the drive to Cecilia Marsh's office because it was different from the drive to Preston Holt's office, and the difference matters. When Angela drove me to Preston Holt, I was a passenger. I sat in the seat my daughter had put me in, and I looked out the window at a city I had lived in for 69 years, and I felt the specific passive quality of a person being taken somewhere rather than going somewhere. I did not notice it then. I notice it now with the clarity of a woman who has had considerable time to examine the textures of that period. I drove myself to Cecilia Marsh's office. On a Thursday morning in November, in my own car, on streets I knew by memory, arriving 12 minutes early because I have been 12 minutes early to everything for 40 years and no 18-month campaign to undermine my competence had changed that. I parked. I went in. Cecilia Marsh was 58 years old, compact, with natural hair going silver at the temples and reading glasses she wore pushed up on her head until she needed them, and the specific, grounded quality of a woman who has been in rooms with frightened people for 32 years and who has learned to be the stillest thing in any room she enters. She shook my hand. She looked at me directly. She said, "Tell me everything." I told her everything. The 18 months, the calls to Paulette and Carolyn and Barbara and Diane, the church community, the sentence finishing, the kitchen table conversation where Angela had taken my clear perception of events and handed it back to me as a symptom, the Thai food after the signing, the lunch with Diane, the picture Diane had assembled in 3 months of her own quiet investigation. Cecilia listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment in the way of a woman organizing what she has heard into the categories that matter. She said, "Mrs. Caldwell, I want to ask you something directly." I said, "Please." She said, "Do you have any concerns about your own cognitive function, setting aside what Angela has told other people? In your own assessment of your own mind, are you experiencing anything that concerns you?" I thought about it. I gave it the full, honest consideration it deserved rather than the reflexive no of a woman defending herself. I said, "No, I am grieving. I am sometimes tired. I am 68 years old and I have had a difficult year and I am not operating at the absolute peak of my capacity, but I know where I am and what day it is and what I signed and why I should not have signed it without more thought." Cecilia nodded. She said, "Then the first thing we need is an independent neurological assessment, not from your regular physician, from a neurologist who has no prior relationship with you or your family and who has received no information about you from Angela or anyone acting on her behalf. We need an assessment that establishes in medical documentation what your current cognitive function actually is. That was the appointment I told you about at the beginning. The neurologist with the clipboard and the questions I could answer at 17 years old, and the moment he set the clipboard down, and we had a very different conversation than the one Angela had intended. His name was Dr. Bernard Ellis. He was at UAB, the University of Alabama at Birmingham, one of the best medical institutions in the state, where the neurological assessment program has a reputation that is difficult to dispute, and that would therefore be difficult for anyone to argue around later. Cecilia had chosen him specifically and deliberately. The assessment took 3 hours, not 3 hours of counting backward from 100, 3 hours of comprehensive cognitive evaluation, memory, language, spatial reasoning, processing speed, executive function, the full range of what a serious neurological assessment actually measures when it is being done by someone who knows what they are doing and is not operating on second-hand reports from a concerned daughter. Dr. Ellis found no evidence of cognitive impairment. He found a woman in the normal range for her age across every measured category, to a woman who performed above average on several of the verbal and executive function assessments, which Cecilia noted when she received the report was exactly what you would expect from a retired educator with 35 years of professional experience managing complex institutional environments. He found, in other words, me. I want to tell you what I felt reading that report. Not relief, or not only relief, something more complicated than relief. Something that was relief and grief and fury in approximately equal measure, the fury arriving last and settling in with the specific clarifying quality of an emotion that has been suppressed for 18 months and that has finally found the permission to be fully itself. I had always known I was myself. And having that knowledge confirmed in 12 pages of neurological documentation was not the experience of discovering something new. It was the experience of watching something true be made undeniable, which is different and which carries its own particular weight. Cecilia filed to revoke the power of attorney. She filed on the same day she received Dr. Ellis's report. The grounds were multiple, and she had constructed them carefully across the weeks between my first appointment with her and the neurological assessment. The power of attorney had been executed in circumstances that this court finds consistent with undue influence, a concept in a state law that addresses exactly this situation, where a document is signed not in the genuine, the informed exercise of a person's own will, but under conditions that have been constructed to produce a specific outcome. The conditions Angela had constructed. Cecilia documented them in the filing with the specific meticulous detail of a woman who had been assembling evidence since November. The timeline of Angela's calls to Paulette, Carolyn, Barbara, Diane. The pattern of those calls, the consistent narrative, the consistent framing, the consistent direction they all pointed. The appointment made by Angela with an attorney of Angela's choosing. The document already on the desk when Ruth arrived. The drive home. 46 pages. Cecilia described it to me when she filed it with the specific, understated satisfaction of a woman who does not get outmaneuvered. She said, "This is a thorough filing." I said, "I noticed." She almost smiled. Well, Angela received the filing on a Monday. She called me on a Monday evening at 6:43 and I answered because I had been waiting for the call since Cecilia filed that morning, and because some conversations you cannot have through attorneys, and this was one of them. She said, "Mama, what is this?" Not a question. The specific, controlled flatness of a person who knows what it is and is asking me to account for myself. I said, "It is a filing to revoke the power of attorney, Angela." She said, "Why would you do that?" "I am trying to help you." I said, "I know you believe that." A pause. She said, "Who have you been talking to?" I said, "My attorney." She said, "Diane put you up to this." I said, "Diane told me the truth. What you do with the truth is not Diane's responsibility." Her voice shifted. Not dramatically. Angela did not do things dramatically, which was one of the things that had made her so effective for so long. Subtly. The specific, almost imperceptible shift of a person moving from one register to another, from the concerned daughter to something that had less patience for the performance of concern. She said, "Mama, I need you to understand that this filing is going to make things very difficult for both of us, for the family." I said, "I understand that." She said, "I have been trying to protect you." I said, "Angela, I have the neurologist's report." Silence. Not a brief silence, a long one. The specific quality of a silence that follows the removal of the ground a person has been standing on. She said, "What report?" I said, "Dr. Ellis at UAB, Comprehensive Neurological Assessment, 12 pages. No evidence of cognitive impairment. Above average on verbal and executive function." She said, "Mama." I said, "I am going to say one thing and then I am going to let the attorneys handle the rest of this." She waited. I said, "I have been reading rooms since before you were born, Angela. I read them for 35 years professionally. I missed this one because you were in it and I trusted you, and that is the last time I will make that mistake." I hung up. I sat at the kitchen table. I thought about Gerald. capable people can do more damage than incapable ones, because they can see further ahead, because they can plan. He had seen it. He had seen it in 2015, in this kitchen, at this table. And I had heard him and nodded and filed it away in the category of things a loving husband says about a complicated daughter, and had not understood that he was telling me something specific. He was telling me something specific. I wished, not for the first time since August of 2019 and not for the last, that he were here. Not to fix it. To sit beside me at this table. To look at me with the specific, steady clarity of a man who had known me for 40 years and who had never, not once, suggested by word or action or expression that I was anything other than exactly who I was. To be the person who saw me. I sat with that for a while, and then I called Cecilia and told her about the phone call. She said, "Document it, time, date, content, verbatim as close as you can get." I said, "I already wrote it down." She said, "Of course you did." The revocation hearing was scheduled for February, 3 months after Cecilia filed. 3 months that had the specific procedural quality of legal time. The document exchanges and the formal notices and the measured institutional pace of a process that does not hurry regardless of the urgency of the people inside it. I was not good at the waiting. I want to be honest about that. I am a woman who spent 35 years at the center of things, who was the last stop, who had the specific organizing function of a person that problems move toward rather than away from. Waiting, the deliberate, disciplined inaction of a legal process in motion, was not a condition I inhabited naturally. I called Cecilia more than she needed me to. She answered every time, which told me something about the kind of attorney she was. And she told me what she could tell me and redirected me to the parts of the process I could usefully occupy myself with. I occupied myself with documentation. 30 years of a retired principal's instinct for records applied to the task of reconstructing the 18 months. Every conversation I could remember. Every interaction with Paulette and Carolyn and Barbara that now carried a different meaning in retrospect. The dates, the textures, the specific details that distinguished ordinary concern from the orchestrated version. I wrote it all down in the yellow legal pad I had bought the week after my lunch with Diane, and I filled 41 pages of it by the end of January. 41 pages. Angela retained an attorney, a man named Douglas Farr, estate law, Birmingham, 15 years of practice. How Cecilia looked him up and said nothing about him in the specific neutral way of a woman who has an opinion she is choosing not to share because the opinion is not relevant to the work. I looked him up myself. 15 years. A modest practice. Not Cecilia Marsh? Not 32 years of winning. I noted the asymmetry and said nothing about it. Douglas Farr's first communication to Cecilia was a letter asserting that the power of attorney had been executed voluntarily and with full understanding by Ruth Annette Caldwell, that there was no basis for revocation, and that the filing represented an unfortunate response to outside interference in a family matter that had been handled with appropriate care and documentation. Appropriate care and documentation. I read that phrase twice. I thought about the document already on Preston Holt's desk when I arrived. I thought about the appointment Angela had made. I thought about the specific, careful sequence of 18 months of groundwork that had preceded that appointment. Cecilia responded in 11 pages. She included the neurological report. She included the documented timeline of Angela's calls, Paulette's account, Carolyn's account, Barbara's account, Diane's account, each one separately documented and dated as best they could be reconstructed. She included a note about the appointment having been made by Angela rather than Ruth. She included a note about Preston Holt and his relationship to Angela, which Cecilia had investigated and which had produced the first piece of information in the legal process that I had not anticipated. Our Preston Holt had done work for Angela before. Not estate work. Business work. Angela ran a consulting practice. 3 years earlier, she had used Preston Holt's firm for a contract dispute. It was a matter of public record, a filing in the civil court system that Cecilia had found without difficulty. Not a disqualifying relationship, not conclusive of anything on its own, but a relationship that existed and that had not been disclosed to me when Angela suggested Preston Holt as the attorney for my estate planning. I had walked into the office of a man who knew my daughter, who had been paid by my daughter, who had a document on his desk when I arrived. I sat with that for a long time. Discovery began in December. Angela's financial records were part of it, not all of them, but the records relevant to the question of what authority the power of attorney had already been used to exercise and what Angela's financial relationship to my estate looked like at the time of the filing. What Cecilia found was this. Angela had not yet used the power of attorney to make any financial transactions. I want to tell you why that fact is less reassuring than it sounds, because I think the instinct is to hear it and feel relief. She hadn't taken anything yet. The document hadn't been used. Maybe this was precautionary. Maybe the picture was less deliberate than it appeared. The picture was more deliberate than it appeared. The reason Angela had not yet used the power of attorney was timing. Cecilia established this through the financial records and through a document that Angela's own attorney produced in discovery that Angela's attorney perhaps did not fully understand the implications of a document that I am going to describe to you because it is the single most important piece of evidence in this case, and because I believe you should know that this kind of document exists and what it means when you find one. It was a draft document created on Angela's computer 14 months before the power of attorney was signed that outlined a proposed restructuring of my estate. Not a legal document, not something that had been filed or formalized or presented to an attorney. A working document, a planning document, and the kind of thing a person creates when they are thinking through a strategy and need to see it written out before they can assess whether it holds together. It outlined the following. A proposed transfer of my house, the house Gerald and I had bought in 1987 and lived in for 35 years, into a trust structure that would be administered by Angela. A proposed consolidation of my retirement accounts under management she would oversee. A proposed amendment to my will that would restructure the distribution of my estate in ways that significantly reduced David's share and significantly increased Angela's. 14 months before I signed the document, 14 months before we sat in Preston Holt's office. She had been planning it since before Gerald was cold in the ground. I want to tell you what I did when Cecilia showed me that document because I think the doing is worth recording. I looked at it. I read every word of it. I looked at the date. 14 months. 2 months after Gerald's funeral, before the calls to Paulette had even begun. I set it down on Cecilia's desk. And I felt, for the first time in the entire 18 months of this story, completely and utterly calm. Not the suppressed calm of a woman managing her own reaction. The genuine calm of a woman who has been given the thing she needed most, which was not vindication. I had never doubted my own mind, but clarity. The specific clean clarity of understanding completely what you are dealing with, of having the full picture. The full picture was this. Gerald died in August of 2019. Angela began planning in October of 2019. She spent the following 14 months building the narrative, the calls, the concerned daughter, the world she constructed around me that would receive her version of me and reflect it back. She spent those 14 months making me smaller in the minds of the people who loved me, making me someone whose judgment could not be trusted, making me someone who needed to be managed. And then, when the ground was prepared, she moved. The power of attorney was not the end of the plan. It was the instrument. The restructuring document was the end of the plan. My house, my retirement accounts, David's inheritance, all of it, reorganized under Angela's administration, legally protected by a document signed by a woman whose competence had been systematically undermined in the minds of everyone who might have questioned the arrangement. That was the plan. That was what the 18 months had been for. Cecilia looked at me across the desk. She said, "Mrs. Caldwell, I want to tell you what we are going to do with this." I said, "I know what we are going to do with this." She looked at me. I said, "We are going to make sure that every person Angela spoke to in the last 18 months understands what they were part of. We are going to make sure Preston Holt understands what his office was used for. We are going to make sure that the power of attorney is revoked completely and permanently, and that the record of why it is being revoked is thorough enough that no version of this can be attempted again." I paused. I said, "And I want David to have everything Gerald intended for him to have." Cecilia nodded. She said, "Then let's make sure that happens." She picked up her pen. And the real work began. The hearing was on a Thursday in February. Birmingham in February has the specific, indeterminate quality of a city that cannot decide whether it is still winter or already spring. Cold mornings that soften by afternoon, the occasional day of genuine warmth that arrives without announcement and that you cannot trust to stay. I had been watching the weather for a week the way people watch the weather when they are using it to manage anxiety about something that has nothing to do with the weather. I drove myself. I want to note that because I noted it at the time, the specific, deliberate act of driving myself to the hearing rather than asking Diane or David or anyone else to take me. Not because I did not want them there. David had driven up from Atlanta the night before and was meeting me at the courthouse. Aunt Diane was coming. Paulette had driven down from Huntsville. I drove myself because I had driven myself to every significant thing in my life, and because the significance of this particular thing was not going to change that. 12 minutes early. The courthouse had the specific institutional gravity of a place that has been the site of serious things for a long time, and that carries the accumulated weight of that in its architecture and its light, and the particular quality of quiet that exists in its corridors before the day begins. David was waiting at the entrance. My son. 40 years old, Gerald's build, Gerald's particular way of standing, weight balanced, unhurried, the physical vocabulary of a man who does not need to perform his own solidity because the solidity is simply there. He hugged me without saying anything, and I let myself be hugged for exactly as long as I needed, and then I straightened, and we went in. Diane was already inside. I want to tell you about the conversation with Paulette first because the order of things matters, and the Paulette conversation happened before the hearing and shaped the way I walked into it. Paulette had called me in January 3 weeks after Cecilia filed. Not because Cecilia had contacted her, because Carolyn had. Carolyn, who had been one of Angela's earliest recruits and who had spent the months since Diane's lunch with me doing her own quiet reckoning with what she had been part of, had called Paulette, and they had talked for 2 hours. 2 women in their late 60s and early 70s, both of whom loved me, both of whom had been handed a narrative by a person they trusted and had carried it without examining it, sitting with the specific, uncomfortable honesty of that realization. Paulette called me on a Sunday evening. She said, "Ruth, I have to tell you something and I need you to let me say the whole thing before you respond." I said, "Okay." She said the whole thing. She told me about Angela's call 6 weeks after Gerald's funeral. She told me what Angela had said, the forgetfulness, the confusion, the accumulating small things. She told me that she had believed it because she was grieving and Angela was concerned, and the story had landed in the specific vulnerability of a family in the middle of loss, where everyone is watching for more things to go wrong. She said, "I should have called you, and I should have said, Angela has said this about you, and I want to know what you think. I have known you for 69 years, Ruth. I know what you look like. I should have looked." I sat with that. She said, "I am sorry." I said, "Paulette, you were grieving too." She said, "That is not an excuse." I said, "No, but it is a reason, and reasons matter." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "Will you let me come to the hearing?" I said yes. She was in the third row when I walked in. She and Diane and David and Carolyn had asked if she could come, and I had said yes for the same reason I had said yes to Paulette. Because the people who had been used deserved to see what they had been used for, and because forgiveness, in my experience, moves faster when it has something to look at. Well, Angela was already seated at the respondents' table when I arrived. I had not seen her since the phone call in November. 3 months. She looked the way Angela always looked. Composed, well-dressed, the specific, careful presentation of a woman who understands that appearance is information and who manages the information she presents with the same attention she brings to everything else. She looked at me when I walked in. I looked at her. Neither of us said anything. There was nothing to say that the 46-page filing and the 12-page neurological report and the 14-month-old draft restructuring document had not already said. The hearing was before Judge Patricia Simmons, a woman in her early 60s, black with the specific, unhurried authority of a judge who has been on the bench long enough to have seen most things and who brings to each new thing the full, undiminished attention of a person who believes that most things deserve it, Cecilia had said. Good. In the tone of a woman who has appeared before this judge before and who is satisfied with the assignment. I trusted that. Judge Simmons read the filing, not a summary, the filing, all 46 pages. I know this because she referenced specific sections during the hearing with the precision of a person who has actually read what is in front of her and not a press song of it. She referenced the timeline. She referenced the neurological report. She referenced the draft restructuring document with a particular attention that I watched Douglas Farr register from across the room. The specific, or almost imperceptible adjustment of a man who had underestimated what was in the filing and who is understanding that fact in real time. She asked Cecilia to walk her through the timeline. Cecilia walked her through it. She did it the way I had watched the best teachers do their best work, not with drama, not with the performative outrage of someone making a case for an audience, but with the specific patient clarity of a person laying out facts in the order that makes their meaning most legible. The October 2019 draft. The calls beginning 6 weeks after Gerald's funeral. Paulette, Carolyn, Barbara, Diane. Each conversation documented, dated, reconstructed from the accounts of the women themselves who had provided written statements that were part of the filing. The kitchen table conversation, the appointment Angela made, a Preston Holt's prior relationship with Angela, the document on the desk. Cecilia laid it all out. When she finished, Judge Simmons looked at Douglas Farr. She said, "Counselor, your response describes this filing as an unfortunate reaction to outside interference in a family matter. I'd like you to address the draft restructuring document specifically, the one dated October 2019. Douglas Farr stood. He said, "Your Honor, that document represents preliminary thinking about estate planning options. It was never formalized or presented," Judge Simmons said. "It was created 2 months after Mr. Caldwell's death and 14 months before the power of attorney was signed." Douglas Farr said, "Yes, Your Honor," Judge Simmons said. "And in those 14 months, Ms. Harris," she looked at Angela, "you conducted a systematic campaign to represent your mother as cognitively impaired to her sister, her friends, her church community, and her physician." Angela's attorney started to speak. Judge Simmons held up one hand. She said, "I am not asking a question, Counselor." The room was very quiet. Judge Simmons looked at the neurological report. She said, "Dr. Ellis's assessment finds no evidence of cognitive impairment and rates Mrs. Caldwell above average on verbal and executive function measures. This assessment was conducted independently at a facility with no prior relationship to either party, at the request of Mrs. Caldwell's attorney." She set the report down. She looked at both tables. She said, "I am going to be direct. The power of attorney executed on September 14th was signed under circumstances that this court finds consistent with undue influence. The signatory's cognitive competence was not in question. The neurological record is unambiguous on that point. What was in question was the context in which the signing occurred, the preparation of that context, and the relationship between that preparation and the document that has been produced in discovery. She looked at Angela. She said, "I am revoking the power of attorney in full. I am further ordering that any future attempt to execute a similar document naming Angela Harris as agent for Ruth Caldwell must be reviewed by this court before it takes effect." She paused. She said, "I am also referring this matter to the Alabama State Bar for review of the conduct of the original executing attorney, R. Preston Holt." I had not known that was possible. I looked at Cecilia. She was writing something on her legal pad and did not look up, but the quality of her posture was the specific, contained quality of a woman who is not surprised by what she is hearing because she asked for it in the filing and has been waiting for it to be granted. She had asked for it in the filing. I had not known. Judge Simmons said, "Is there anything further?" Cecilia said, "Your Honor, the petitioner would ask the court to note for the record the specific individuals who provided testimony regarding the respondent's conduct, in recognition of the fact that those individuals acted in good faith on information presented to them by the respondent." Judge Simmons looked at her. She said, "So noted." The hearing was over in 40 minutes, and I sat for a moment after Judge Simmons left the bench. David put his hand on my arm. I looked at the respondent's table. Angela was speaking quietly to Douglas Farr. She had the specific contained quality of a person processing something in public that she would prefer to process privately, the composed exterior held with the particular effort of someone who has had a great deal of practice at it. She did not look at me. I did not need her to. I looked at the third row. Paulette, Diane, Carolyn, 3 women in their late 60s and 70s who had been used by my daughter and who had come to this room anyway, who had given statements, who had sat in these seats and been the specific, imperfect human evidence of what Angela had built and what it had cost. I had not been alone in this, and that was the thing I kept returning to in the days after the hearing, in the specific slow process of understanding what had been restored. Not the power of attorney. The revocation of that was a legal outcome, clean and documented and final. Something else. The thing Angela had actually tried to take. She had not, in the end, been able to take it. She had tried to make me smaller in the minds of the people who knew me, to replace the Ruth they had known for decades with a diminished version, to make the woman who had run Jefferson High School for 19 years into a woman who needed to be managed. And the people she had tried to do it with had shown up in a courtroom in February and told the truth. That was what was restored. Not just my legal standing. My world. I went back to school the week after the hearing. Not Jefferson. I am retired. The building belongs to someone else now. A principal named Marcus Webb, who by all accounts is doing fine work, and who does not need me walking his hallways with the specific, proprietary attachment of a woman who ran them for 19 years. I went back as a visitor. I had been invited to speak to the senior English classes about my career, about what I learned, about what I would tell my younger self. I stood at the front of a classroom for the first time in 4 years. 31 teenagers looked at me, testing me the way teenagers always test. I looked back at them with the calm and total confidence of a woman who has been preparing for rooms like this her entire life. They stopped testing me by the second minute. Some things do not change. I want to tell you where Angela and I are. Because I think the honest ending of this story, like every honest ending, is not clean. The power of attorney is revoked. The bar referral has been filed and is under review. Preston Holt's relationship to this matter is now a matter of record. My will is intact. David will receive what Gerald intended for him to receive. Those things are resolved. Angela and I are not. We have not spoken since the phone call in November when I told her I had the neurologist report and hung up. Not for lack of trying on my part. I have reached out twice, carefully, through channels that left her room to respond or not respond as she chose. She has not responded. I do not know if she will. I do not know what a conversation between us would look like now, or whether the distance between who she has turned out to be and who I believed she was for 44 years is a distance that words can cross. I do not know. I am trying to stay in the not knowing without mistaking it for an answer. I want to say something to Angela. Angela, you spent 18 months making me smaller. You called the people who loved me and you handed them a version of me that was diminished and frightened and in need of management, and you did it carefully and you did it well, and if Diane had been reachable, if the 22 years had not made her immune to the version you were selling, it might have worked. It did not work. I am still here. The woman who ran Jefferson High School for 19 years. The woman who drove herself to the hearing 12 minutes early. The woman whose neurologist found above average verbal and executive function, and who could have told him that without the assessment. I am still here. And I want you to know, I am not done being your mother. I do not know what that means yet, in practical terms. I do not know what we are capable of from here. But I have not closed that door, and I am not going to close it unilaterally, because closing it would make me into someone I do not want to be, and because Gerald loved you, and I loved you, and neither of those things has a revocation filing. Come back when you are ready to be honest. To everyone who is still here, tell me where you are watching from, city, state, what time it is there. Drop it in the comments. I want to know who stayed with me through all of it. And I need to ask you something before you go. If someone you trusted started telling the people in your world that you were not yourself, not dramatically, not all at once, but quietly and consistently and over a long enough period of time that the story took hold, would you know? Would the people who love you be able to resist it? Would there be a Diane in your life? Leave your answer below, because that is the question I have been living with since November. And I think it is the most important question this story asks. Not what do you do after you find out. Before. Who in your world knows you well enough, and clearly enough, and independently enough to push back when someone hands them a story about you that isn't true? Find that person. Tell them what you just heard. Because the best protection against what Angela did is not legal, it is relational. It is the specific, sustaining clarity of people who know you in the way that Diane knew me. People who have 22 years of you. People who cannot be managed. And one practical thing before I go. If someone asks you to sign a power of attorney, any power of attorney, for any reason, presented by any person, do not sign it in the same appointment where you first see it. Take it home. Have your own attorney review it. An attorney you found. An attorney who has not spoken to the person who handed you the document. The document on the desk means nothing if you do not pick up the pen. I did not know that then. You know it now. If this story found the place in you that recognized it, share it. For the woman in your life who is grieving and alone and whose family is paying close attention. Help me find her before someone hands her a pen. And subscribe, because I have more stories, and every one of them is true, and every one of them belongs to a woman who did not let someone else write the ending. I am Ruth. I drove myself home from that courthouse, 12 minutes, the same roads I've been driving for 40 years. And when I got home, I made coffee and I sat at the kitchen table and I looked at the chair where Gerald used to sit, and I told him what happened. I told him he was right about her. I told him I wished he had been wrong, and I told him that some things do not change, that the good stuff holds, that Ruth Annette Caldwell is still exactly herself, and she always will be.